Today's daf is daf Hey. The Mishnah says, "U'mesachnin es kilkule hamayim sheb'reshus harab." So we have cisterns of water where the rainwater collects, and if there's some crack or some damage, and if it's b'reshus harabim, it's in a public domain, and as a result of this damage, let's say there's branches of trees or soil or rocks or whatever it has that clogs up these cisterns, you're allowed to clear them out on Chol Moed for the sake of the Rab. Now, the language of the Mishnah is mechatetin also, which the Gemara is medayik chatita in, chafira lo. So you're allowed to clear out all of this clogged stuff that's clogging up the cisterns of water and remove all the debris. That's mutter, that's permitted. But the implication is that to dig a new cistern, even for the sake of the rabbim, that would not be permissible. Rab Yaakov, Rab Yochanan, Lo shanu el she'ein rabbim tzrichem. The Mishnah is addressing a case where the water supply is not necessary for the drinking of the people, of the public, because Haval Rabbim tzrichem, had it been a case where the public needed to drink from that cistern, then afilu chafira mutter, they'd be even allowed on Chol Moed to dig a new cistern, because as we said on the previous Amud, Meleches Chol Moed l'tzorchei Rabbim is mutter. The Gemara asks, "V'chi Rabbim tzrichem le'mishari." Is Rabbi Yochanan's assumption and his ruling correct? Vasanya, how will you reconcile it with the following brisa? Otetin boros sichen u'ma'oros shel yachid. You're allowed to clear out various kinds of cisterns, either boros, or which are probably ditches. Sichen u'ma'oros are different kinds of caves of different shapes, whether they're square or triangular. Siach, for example, ma'ora is square. A siach is like long and narrow. But this is only mutter because of chotetin. And you might say, well, that's only shel yachid. But then the brisa continues, says, "V'ein tzarich lo shel rabbim." That heter, that leniency that we're going to allow you on Chol Moed to do this work of chotetin, that applies equally and even moreover to be matir in the case of boros shel rabbim. But v'ein chofrin boros sichen u'ma'oros shel rabbim. However, chafir itself, even for the sake of the public, is prohibited. V'ein tzarich lo shel yachid, it goes without saying that for the sake of a yachid, it's going to be prohibited. So it would seem that when we're talking about ma'orot shel rabbim or sichen shel rabbim, boros shel rabbim, my labish rabbim tzrichem lehem, it's a case where the public needs it. So on Yontif, this is where they're going to get access to their water. That's where the supply of water will be drawn from. So how could the brisa prohibit digging the cistern, the ditch, the ma'oros, sichen, the caves, etc., l'chatchila? That's against Rabbi Yochanan, who says clearly that l'tzorchei rabbim, it's mutter. Lo, therefore the Gemara answers that b'she'ein rabbim tzrichem lehem. So it means that the question here is whether it's owned by an individual or owned by the public, but it's not a situation where the public needs access to the water on Chol Moed, on Yontiv, because that would certainly, in the light of Rabbi Yochanan's ruling, be mutter even b'chafira. So the Gemara says, can we really accept this interpretation of the brisa, the kavasa gabi yachid? Whatever you'll say about shel rabbim, you have to now apply it to shel yachid. And you're talking about a case of ein tzrichem lehem. No, if ein hayachid tzarich lehem chatita mishari, would we be matir, be lenient, unclogging all the dirt and all the debris that fell into these ditches and so forth that are owned by Yochid, if there's no need to get involved in that malacha on Chol Moed. There's nothing pressing even for the Yochid. So Chatita Mishari Vatanya, we learned in the Brisa, Boros Sichin Amor Shel Yochid, Konsim Mayim L'Sochan, Avalo Chotetin. I mean, you see clearly there's no heter for Chatita, even to clear the debris out of the ditches and the caves. We're only allowed to gather the water there. Again, what exactly is the chiddush here that you're allowed to gather the water in the ditches? I mean, what action are you involved in? And the Mishnah Berurah writes in Sha'ar Tziyun that we're talking about directing waters even into these existing reservoirs of water. And we're allowed to do that, but to work in the ditches and in the reservoirs and clear them out of debris, that's prohibited. Lo shofenes sidkeim, if there are cracks in the plaster of these reservoirs, of these ditches, you're not allowed to plaster them up to fix those cracks. Shel Rabim chotetin oson shofenes sidkeim, but apparently there's no heter of chafira to dig them lechatchila, which is called creating a brand new reservoir. That's awesome. So again, bishlema, it would make sense if the brisa that we spoke about earlier, Vasanya chotetin boros sichin amor shel yochid, if that permission would refer to a case where the water was needed during the yontif, then we could say that this brisa, which prohibits it, because it says boros sichin amor shel yochid lo chotetin, that's a case where you don't need it. So that would be a simple reconciliation of the two brises. Brisa number one is talking about a case where you need the water on Yontif, and therefore Chatita is mutter. The second brisa that prohibits Chatita is talking about where you don't need the water on Yontif. But you just told me that the first brisa is talking about a case where you don't need these reservoirs and pits and so forth, ditches on Yontif. You don't have to clear them out. And if that be the case, then when it says chotetin boros, etc., shel yochid, we're allowing chatita even when you don't need it. What are you going to do with this price that says you're not allowed to do chatita? Elamai. So let's go back to the first price and say b'she yochid sarchlem. It's a case where the yochid needs these ditches in order to get access to water on Yontif. Tikavosi gabi rabim. Then the parallel case with regard to a publicly owned ditch would be ksharabim tzrichin lehem. The yochid needs it and the rabim needs it. It was then therefore chafir miyasa. You know, why should we prohibit even chafira in a case where rabim tzrichin lehem? And we saw again, Rabbi Yochanan says that indeed rabim tzrichin lehem afil chafira mutter. But we'll prove that point from a brisa of Asanya. This is actually the third brisa that we have in our sugya. Boros sichin ma'oros shel yochid konsim mayim l'sochan. So then, here in this brisa, we're allowing you to do this gathering of the water that we discussed before. Chotetin also, you're allowed to clear out the garbage that's inside, that's clogging up the ditches. Avalo shofenes sidkeim. We don't allow you to plaster the cracks. Below chotin l'sochan, and we're not going to allow you to clear out that which is the debris that fell into them. Below sodin osam besid, and how much more so we're not allowed to smear them with lime. But v'shel rabim chofer osam, sodin osam betit. So you see that if there's a need for the public, then clearly you're allowed to dig the ditch lechatchila. And you're telling me that the previous price is talking about a case of Yachid Tzarech Lahem, which means that in the case of the Rabbim, it's also Tzarech Lahem. And yet, the Brisa prohibits Chafira and Avalo, right? And not only that, it's very strange because if we go back to the first Brisa for a moment, first Brisa says Ein Chofrin, even shall Rabbin. But you're telling me it's a case of Rabbin Tzrichim Lahem. I mean, here clearly we see from this Brisa number 3 that Rabbin Tzrichim Lahem, you're allowed to do a Chafira, even L'chatchila, to start from the get-go, to dig these pits. Therefore, the Gemara says, Al-Kasha Hachkamaisa, right? The first Brisa says that even in a case of Boris Sichon Morishal Rabim, Ein Chofrin, that becomes difficult. And it certainly contradicts the last Brisa that we just had, Brisa number 3, Tritz Hachi. Let's go back to the first Brisa and change the Nusach a little bit. And it should read as follows: Chotetin Boros Shel Yachid Bisha Yachid Sarach Lahem. That if it's a bar Shel Yachid, we're going to allow Chatita, right, to clear out the debris, if they need the water on Yom. It goes without saying that if it's a publicly owned bar, for sure you're allowed to do Chatita. But it's Kisharabim Tzrichim Lahem. And then, when we get to the case of Rabim Tzrichim Lahem, Afilu Chafira Muta. That's what we're adding to the Brisa. That in that case, that Rabim Tzrichim Lahem, even Chafir L'chatchila is Muta. The Ein Chofrin Boros Sichin Amor Shal Rabim, which ain't Rabim Tzrichim Lahem. The Ein Tzarech Lo Shal Yachid. The Chi Ein Yachid Tzarech Lahem Afilu Chatita Nami Os. So in the case of a Boros Shal Rabim, we would allow Chatita even if Einam Tzrichim Lahem, but if it's Tzrichim Lahem, we're going to allow Afilin Chafira. In the case of Boros Shal Yachid, it's only when it's Tzrichim Lahem that we could allow Chatita, but not Chafira. Amar Avashi, Maslisa Nami Deika, I could support this conclusion from our Mishnah. The Katan, it says in our Mishnah, Osim Kol Tzorchei Rabim, that anything necessary for the Rabbim is mutter. Now look at the language of the Mishnah. It says kol. So the Gemara asks kol asuye mai. The word kol in the Mishnah always comes as a ribui. Lav lasuye chafira. Says Rav Ashi, it makes sense to say that the word kol here is coming to include digging a brand new reservoir or cistern or ditch or a pit. The Gemara says that's not a proof. If you're building your case on your diak of the word kol in the Mishnah, low. But rather, the extra kol is coming to include a different case. Lasuya lesanya, as we learned in a brisa, yotzim lekavetz es hadrochim. We're now talking about sending out shluchei bezdin to go out during Chol Moed, and people are moving back and forth. Maybe there's also Olei Regel, and there are thorns in the road. So we're going to send out the shluchei bezdin to check out if there are thorns in the road, clear that out, they're dangerous. Ulesakedes or chovos, to repair all the public roads. Vesa isteratios is a marketplace. Velamod es ha-mikvos, and we have to measure the mikvos, make sure that they have our boim so, the minimum volume of water, so that the people can be tovel in the mikvah. V'chol mikvah shebo our boim so. If they chance upon a mikveh that has less than the required 40 saw, margilin l'socha arboim saw. So if we have water that we could direct into the mikveh to bring it up to the shear of our boim saw, we're allowed to do this. Uminayin shim lo yotzu v'yasu kol elu. And we know that there's a severe punishment for a negligence on the part of the shluchei bezdin. They didn't go out to check these things out. Shekol domim. If chas v'sholem people were injured, or maybe even worse, as a result of their pshia, that they didn't go out, they were negligent. As if they had spilled that blood. The Torah says that the blood will be upon you. And that's a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Tes, and that's a case in which it's Beis Din that's obligated to try a murderer, and if they don't do so, the blood that was spilled is counted as if it's on the heads of Beis Din. The Gemara says that these cases that we mentioned before could not possibly be what the Mishnah had in mind with the extra ribui of the word kol. Because the Mishnah states explicitly, so what are you adding in the word kol when it says that the shluchei Beis Din are out there to repair the roads, the streets, the mikvos? So Gemara goes back and says, "V'osim kol tzorchei rab lasuye mai, lav lasuye chafira shmamino." Let's go back to Rav Ashi's original understanding that when it says kol tzorchei rabim, it means even chafira. If there's a need for the rabbim to have access to water, that's a public need, and we can matter even chafir. The Mishnah says mitzainin es hakvaros, that wherever there's a kever, we have to put a tziyun kever, a marker, so that people would know that there's a corpse that's buried there. Amar Rab Shimon ben Pazi, remez l'tziyun kvaros min haTorah minayin. Can we find a source in the Torah, or at least allusion in the Torah, to the fact that we have to set aside these monuments, these markers for grave sites? Talmud Lomar, and we're going to have to derive it from a pasuk in Yechezkel, when Yechezkel had a nevuah about the Milchemes Gog uMagog and the aftermath in the future of that terrible war. Eretz Yisrael will be littered totally with corpses of the army of Gog, and even after the land has been mainly cleansed, if anyone sees a remnant of a human bone, then he has to put up a marker near there. And the pasuk says, the ra etzem, he finds a bone, adam, of a human being, ubana etzlo tziyun, he's got to build a marker on it. Now, again, this is only an illusion. This is only a remez to the requirement of putting up a tziyun kever. You can't derive a chova from here. Markers are required for corpses that transmit tumah through the method of ohel, where the corpse would convey and transmit tumah to a person who passes over them. And that's true even if it was buried. So there's a need to mark it in order to alert people to keep that distance. Now, if you have something that's only mavir tumah, it only is metame through mago or hesed, but not through tumas oel, like, for example, a bone from one of Gog's soldiers would not transmit tumah through an oel, because individual bones, as a general rule, only convey tumah through maga or masa, contact or moving them. And non-Jewish corpses, at least according to one opinion, even if they're whole, the entire corpse did not transmit tumah through ohel. So the situation that is addressed, the scenario addressed in this pasuk, is certainly not going to teach us what we want to derive. And burial itself would be enough to obviate the need for a tziyun kever. So we're talking about something that is metame be'oel and really requires a tziyun kever, and that's not the case that Yechezkel is talking about after the Milchemes Gog uMagog. Amalei Ravina Rav Ashi, Hamakami Delese Yechezkel Man Omar. All right, you have somewhat of an illusion in the Pasuk Yechezkel, but until Yechezkel came around, there was no requirement of a tziyun kever. So this was the question that Ravina addressed to Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, what about you, Ravina? The underlying premise of your kasha, Hadi Omer Rav Chizda, Dover Zemi Torah Moshe Rabbeinu Lola Madnu, according to Rav Chizda, we're talking now about an Orel, a Kohen Orel, who's possibly avoid in the Mikdash. We don't learn this from the Torah. But Midivri Yechezkel ben Buzi Laman. And there's an entire chapter in Yechezkel, which is a chapter that's dedicated in chapter Mem Daled to the laws of Avodas Kohanim. So the psul of an Orel in a Kohen situation for Avodas is derived from this pasuk called Ben Nechar Erel Lev Erel Basalo Yovel Mikdashi. Is Maccabi Delesem Yechezkel Man Omar, who said where do we derive this from before Yechezkel? Elo, we have no choice but to assume that Gemara Gmirle, we have halacha Moed Sinai that transmits this halacha that an Orel, a Kohen Orel, is Pasal Avoda. Also Yechezkel Yasmachei Akra. Okay, so Yechezkel came along and gave us a support in a pasuk. Is therefore Hachanami here too with regard to Tziyun Kever is Gemara Gmirle. It's halacha Moed Sinai. We also Yechezkel Yasmachei Akra. Yechezkel did nothing more than offer us support from a text, from a verse in the scriptures. Rabbi Yevo Amar Yinhach. Rabbi Yevo has a different alternative source as a remez for Tziyun Kever, and that's in the Parsha Mitzorah. It says V'tamei tamei yikra, that the Mitzorah himself has to, so to speak, scream out. It's a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Yud Gimel that I am a tamei, and he says it twice. Tamei tamei. Tuma korolo yomer slow pro. That tum itself, so to speak, is crying out to anyone who passes by and says, "Proach." Proach means stay away. So the pasuk really requires that the Mitzorah alert others that he's tummy. Ravo derives from this that any tumah should be clearly marked so that people will recognize it and keep their distance. Rabbi Uziel Bar Braid, Rabbi Uziel Rabbah. He's the grandson of Rav Uziel Rabbah. Tuma korolo v'yomerslo prosh. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, v'hai lahachi udiasa? Is this going to tell me that we have to mark graves just like we have to make sure that people know about the Tumas Mitzorah, Hahumi Boila? We need that pasuk of Tami Yikra Lichesanya for a ruling, a halacha that's derived from this pasuk in a brisa. Tami Yikra, Tarchlo Diat Saro L'Rabin. The Mitzorah who's suffering now in his isolation has to share with the public his misfortune, v'Rabbim Vakchanol Rachman, so that the Rabbim will be Mavakesh Rachamim on his part. So when it says Tami, this has nothing to do with alerting people are passing by that there's tumah that exists here, but rather to arouse the sympathy of the passers-by so that they will pray on behalf of the afflicted person, in this case, the Mitzorah. So where it says in Cain, Lichtov Tami Yikra, why the double language Tami? We derive two things from this pasuk. Tami Yikra means he has to notify people so that they'll pray on his behalf. But Tami, the actual word Tami, is there to notify people that he's Tami and they should be on alert to distance themselves from Tumah. So that's the source of Rabbi Avo. Now the Gemara goes on to another possible source, Abaye Omer Mihacha. Let's derive it from Parshas Kedoshim, and it says there, Vayikra Yutes, make sure to get rid of any stumbling block in front of a blind person. And here, if no one knows that there's a kever there, then we're all blind, so to speak. So we have to notify that there's a takol over here, a stumbling block. And Rav Papa Amar, he has a different pasuk from Yeshaya Navi, and that is the Omar Solu Solu Panu Der, pave, clear the road. So it means that we have to clear the road of anyone who might, if he doesn't know about the corpse that's buried there, might contract tumor. Rabbi Chinin Omar, he has a diuk in the end of that same pasuk, Solu Palu Derech, and there it says, remove the obstacle from my people's path. Let's derive it from a pasuk in Shmos Perek Yud Ches, and there it says, and a derech means to make sure that they know which derech they're allowed to travel on, because there's no fear that they might be mekabel tumah. Mar Zutra Amar, he has an alternative pasuk, and this pasuk in Vayikra Perek Tesvav says, "V'zartem espedei Yisrael mitumosam." Mitumosam means you shall separate the children of Israel from their tumah. Rav Ashi Amar, Ushmartem es mishmarti. The Torah says in that same chapter in Vayikra, you shall safeguard my charge. And what does that mean? Asu mishmeres mishmarti. In other words, if there's something that requires shmira and protection, then you should make a mishmeres. Ani hine nasati lecha es mishmeres trumotzai. I give you in charge of my trumos, and that means that you have to protect truma, that it shouldn't be contaminated. And there's an allusion here to provide an added measure of protection for those who possess truma by clearly marking off locations of truma that they should avoid. Ravina Amar, he derives it from a pasuk in Tehillim, V'sam derech arenu b'yesha Elukim, and one who sets the way, that's called Sam Derech, I will show him Arenu b'yesh Elukim, the salvation of God. So setting the way here means providing a sign to indicate where people may travel or may not travel. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Kol Hassam Archos, a little bit of a Gadic interlude here. If a person appraises his ways, some archosav, he always looks back at his ways and he investigates them, and he does a cheshbon nefesh. He'll witness the salvation of the Holy One. In other words, the salvation of Klal Yisrael through the Holy One. And he's always constantly weighing the loss that he might incur by doing a mitzvah against the eternal reward that it might bring, and the gain that he might realize to a sin against the far greater loss that will result. He attains genuine righteousness and is protected from every sin. Shenemar v'sam derech al tikri v'sam. Don't read it as setting. Ela v'sham derech arenu v'yesh Elokim. Read it as one who appraises in this way, I will show him the salvation of God. So it means the middle letter of the word v'sham should be read as a shin and not as a sin. And we're not changing the Masorah here. We're just saying that al pi derech hadrush, we can discover a deeper meaning in the pasuk. Rabbi Yanai Havile Ahu Talmidei at a Talmud T'chol Yoma Avi Makshile kept asking him questions on a daily basis. However, b'Shabsa, on Shabbos, the Regila, and it was Shabbos during a regel like Sukkot or Pesach or possibly even Shavuos, lo avi makshil. He would not stand up and ask a kasha on Rabbi Yana. These were very public drashos, and if he would ask a kasha, this very sharp Talmud, it could be that Rabbi Yana would be embarrassed. And since it was a great public, he wouldn't embarrass or even have a suffix of embarrassing his Rebbe. Here on Daf Hey of Beis, Kari Le Rav Yana called a pasuk on him, V'sham derech our Enu Kim. One who praises his way, I will show him the salvation of God. Does he wisely assessed his way that he would only ask a kasha on the Shia, but in this public forum, he was careful not to ask a kasha and not to jeopardize and expose Rabbi Yanai possibly to humiliation in public if he didn't know the answer to his question. Here we are on Daf Hey Yomi Beis.